Namaste. Welcome to Himalaya TV. We are delighted to bring you a special interview with two distinguished guests from the International Monetary Fund IMF. Currently visiting Nepal is a high-level IMF delegation led by Dr. Krishna Srinivasan, Director of the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department. Joining him is Dr. Sarwat Jahan, the Mission Chief for Nepal and Deputy Division Chief in the Asia and Pacific Department. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Krishna Srinivasan and Dr. Sarwat Jahan to the show. Welcome to Nepal, Dr. Srinivasan. As a senior IMF official, this visit is significant after a long time. Could you please share the main purpose of your 3-day visit?
Thank you for the question. So this is my first visit to Nepal, and I've had an excellent trip so far, not just meeting people, policymakers, private sector people in think tanks, but also having some cultural immersion.
Yeah.
So for me, this trip is very meaningful because staying in Washington, you don't get to hear from people on the ground how things are. Yes. So this is an opportunity for me to engage with a wide group of stakeholders, which includes policymakers. We met with the finance minister, the governor, the prime minister, but we also met with participants from the private sector, think tanks, CSOs, and other people. So for me, it's important to get information from people on the ground, and that's this purpose. This meeting, this visit was in that sense very meaningful.
Welcome also to Dr. Sarwat. As IMF Mission Chief for Nepal, I understand that you have visited Nepal several times.
Yes.
How would you describe your engagement here?
Well, thank you for the warm welcome here today. I have been to Nepal. Actually, this is my 4th visit here. And every time I've come to Nepal, I've been amazed by the beauty of the country, but even more so by the resilience of the Nepali people. I'm a part of a larger IMF team. We have several experts in the head office in Washington, D.C., but also we have a resident representative office here in Kathmandu. And our collective engagement has been very productive. Every time we're here, we have very candid discussions, not just with the authorities, but also with many stakeholders. And I think because of these candid, open discussions, we've been able to engage in various types of policy changes and reforms. I think this is also why Nepal has been able to stay the course on its own homegrown reforms.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan. As the Director of Asia Pacific Department, you have a holistic view of the performance of the region. So what highlights would you like to share with Nepal?
So this is a region which is extremely dynamic. For this year, we expect growth at 4.5%. And for next year, slowing down to 4.1%. So broadly speaking, a very fast-growing region. And what I would say is that it's very resilient, the region. And the reason why we think it's resilient, it's for, I would identify 3 factors. One, of course, is there's been an export boom, export front-loading from countries, which also reflects the initiative of the private sector, which is very agile. There's been a tech boom. You've seen increase in tech exports from countries like Korea and Japan.
Exactly.
In addition, many countries have provided macro policy support, whether it's monetary policy support or some cases fiscal policy support. In some countries, both, right? And financial conditions have been very supportive.
Yeah.
So for these reasons put together, the region is showing a lot of resilience. However, I would identify that resilience is not the only thing. Going forward, there are some reasons of concern. Why do I say that? If you look at the growth going forward and you compare that with growth pre-pandemic, clearly growth is slowing in this region. So that's a sense of concern. Why is that? And partly because you see productivity has been falling across many countries in the region.
Right.
In many countries, population is aging.
Right.
So this is a concern. In many countries, consumer confidence is still pretty weak.
Right.
Youth unemployment is high. So these are factors which weigh upon prospects going forward. Even in the near term, there are some risks to the outlook. What do I mean by that? So for example, why has growth been resilient? One thing I said is because exports have been booming. But also a key factor is that the tariffs which were imposed by the US in April have been coming down.
Yes.
Countries have negotiated trade deals which have led to lower tariffs. However, there is still uncertainty about those trade agreements. So the question is, there are some downside risks with the trade tensions. Also, financial conditions have been very supportive so far.
Yeah.
That could change.
Yeah.
So for these reasons, we are saying that yes, the region is resilient. It's contributing 60% to global growth.
Exactly.
At the same time, there are risks to the downside, which we need to factor into account. And that all has implication for policies that countries pursue in both in the near term and for the medium term.
Dr. Sarwat, amidst the global headwinds that Dr. Srinivasan just mentioned, how do you see Nepal's growth trajectory? And what are the biggest risks to achieving this growth? And what steps does the IMF recommend to mitigate them?
Great. Thank you for the question. We are seeing that there is a recovery in place in Nepal. A few short years ago, in fiscal year 2023, Nepal's GDP growth rate was a mere 2%.
Yeah.
Since then, there has been a gradual recovery.
Yeah.
In the fiscal year that ended in 2024, growth actually accelerated to 3.7%.
Yes.
And the IMF now estimates that the year that ended in July 2025, growth will be well above 4%. In fact, the government is projecting that growth would be somewhere between 4.6 to 4.7%. So as you can imagine, in a few short years, the pace of real GDP growth has more than doubled. For this current fiscal year, we still believe and we are quite confident that the economic recovery will continue, although the pace may be moderated a bit. And that's also because the domestic situation is a bit complex at the moment, and there is lingering global uncertainty. So a natural question would be, how do we project this growth, or why do we believe that Nepal will still be on the course of economic recovery? And the answer to that is that our growth projections is based on several assumptions.
Yeah.
One of the big assumptions that we have is that the growth will be underpinned by strong investment, especially the budget measures that are undertaken to execute capital expenditure. We feel that this will be a driving force to bring back growth to the economy. But also, this will be accompanied by fiscal discipline that the authorities have shown in the past. And what we mean by that is that there's a revenue generation that the authorities will be able to achieve, and expenditures will be kept in line with that revenue generation. We have seen that monetary policy has been accommodative in the past, and we expect this to continue, especially as there is now price stability in Nepal. And I would also like to highlight a very important point is that we strongly believe that structural reforms will play a role in this growth trajectory, especially the fact that, there should be good governance in the country. But of course, as in any type of projections, there's always some risks to the outlook. And here in Nepal, we think one of the risks would be if capital execution is not as strong as we had envisioned. In fact, that's why we place a strong emphasis on capital expenditure, targeted towards strategic projects to continue. So these projects should be quite productive. The other uncertainty which many people in Nepal now feel is also the political uncertainty that we're seeing. So if this lingers for longer, there could be an impact on consumer confidence and especially on investor confidence. And I'd also like to point out the financial sector. There are vulnerabilities in the financial sector. We do see NPLs that have been rising. Now the question is, we have to address these problems, and we also have to be careful of the cooperatives because if the financial sector vulnerabilities continue to increase, this could impact credit flows, which is an important component to generate growth. And furthermore, there could be some kind of stability issues or stability risk in the financial sector. There's also the risk that Nepal, as with other countries in the world, is in an interconnected world. If Nepal's large trading partners, for example, India or China, face some kind of shock, or if there is some issues with the remittance source countries for Nepal, clearly there will be some spillovers in Nepal.
Yeah, exactly.
The good news is, though, Nepal can mitigate these risks. As I had mentioned, Strong public investment is important, but the strong public investment must be very targeted towards important strategic projects that have high productivity. So this will then generate growth. Fiscal discipline is important. Having monetary policy that supports fiscal policy will be important. And of course, there's nothing that can substitute for good governance to promote against corruption measures and in general to create a conducive investment climate.
Yeah, thank you, Sarwat. So, Sarwat just mentioned about the spillover risk, and I would like to come to Dr. Srinivasan. I have a question, sort of question about the geopolitics, right? India is a rapidly growing economy in the world. Yet neighboring countries like Nepal haven't fully benefited from its spillover effects. Based on your experience across the different regions, what does the IMF recommend to mitigate them?
Okay, thanks for the question. So, as you mentioned, India is growing pretty fast. It's the fastest growing major economy.
Exactly.
We have India growing at 6.6% this year, slowing to about 6.2% next year. So, over the medium term, we have India growing at 6.5%. So, and as Sarwat mentioned, if you look at Nepal over the next couple of years, you have growth at about 5%.
Yeah.
Now, these two countries are quite well integrated. Nepal imports about 60% of its imports from India. There are many Nepali citizens who work in India. So there are these linkages which are very strong. The question you ask is, what are the spillover effects?
Exactly.
So yes, if India does well, it does have an impact on Nepal, both in terms of what they can import, how people can be employed in the country, and so on. But at the end of the day, how Nepal does is a function of policies and the framework here.
Yeah.
So in the case of Nepal, the macro fundamentals are pretty strong. The growth is holding up well. Inflation is down. Fiscal deficit is well contained. And reserves are pretty high. But what's important is that the micro fundamentals, the structural reforms, are still need to be there, need to be undertaken. For instance, private investment is very weak.
Yes.
And why is that? And you have issues relating to governance and corruption. You have issues related to rule of law, security, and so on, and political instability. So all these factors, they're all domestic factors which weigh on confidence, which weigh on sentiment, and that therefore on private investment. So if you want Nepal to grow at a much faster rate, including through private investment picking up, generating more jobs, these fundamental reforms have to be addressed.
Excellent. Thank you. Moving to the IMF program in Nepal, the program is now at the very tail end with only one review remaining. So could you share your views on what progress Nepal has made so far under the program?
Yes, thank you. So let's take a moment to reflect back. So I'm taking you back to January 2022 when the Nepali authorities had approached the IMF for a program. At that time, COVID had a big toll on the Nepali economy.
Yeah, exactly.
So the main task or the main aim of the program was then to help the authorities' response to the pandemic. Also very important was to ensure that there would be macroeconomic and financial stability. And very important, the focus of the program was to help to protect the poor and the vulnerable. Now, it has been 4 years since the program approval. And looking now at Nepal's economy, we do see that there is tangible progress. We had talked about the growth recovery that we had seen that in a few short years, real GDP growth came from only 2% to now well over 4%. So double the pace. Krishna just had mentioned about the macroeconomic big picture.
Exactly.
So, for example, if you look at Nepal's international reserves right now, the foreign reserves, it's about $20 billion US dollars.
Yeah, exactly.
And if I put it in terms of import coverage, that's enough for Nepal to import a year's worth of imports. That is quite a big achievement. Inflation currently is below 2%, and it's well within Nepal Rashtra Bank's target.
Yeah.
And then because of the fiscal discipline, debt in Nepal is quite manageable. It is very stable. And this is very different from many other countries we've seen that has come out of the COVID. In addition to this, Nepal has also achieved quite a few milestones on structural reforms. So for example, when we look at the fiscal sector, a country can only do priority spending if it has the resources to do so. And so Nepal had developed its own domestic revenue mobilization strategy, which helps the country focus on how to generate revenues without hurting growth. And then, of course, there was a focus on fiscal transparency and accountability. And there, too, Nepal had produced a tax expenditure report. They also had produced a fiscal strategy, a fiscal risk strategy statement. And then both Krishna and I had talked about how important capital expenditure here is in Nepal. But to do a good capital expenditures, you also have to do a good selection of the capital projects. And also under the program, Nepal had amended its National Project Bank guidelines. And the aim of that was to ensure that capital projects would be selected that are very viable and would be productive. And there would be a strong case for their execution. So that's on the fiscal front. Let me give you an example from the financial sector. In the financial sector, monitoring of the banking sector has been strengthened. And right now, as you know, there is a loan portfolio review that's being conducted for 10 of the largest banks in Nepal. And that is to gauge the health of the banking system. Also, there is work underway to amend the Nepal Rashtra Bank Act, which will also, strengthen its autonomy, independence, and governance. So there's a big holistic reforms that Nepal has undertaken in these 4 years. And we congratulate the people of Nepal to do these strong reforms and to bring back stability into the country. But one thing I must stress, and I echo Krishna's words here, is that Nepal is not really out of the woods yet. On the macro picture, we see that, the story is very good. But in the micro part, we still see weak domestic demand. We still see lack of investor confidence. And so, with the macro stability, now Nepal has to focus on growth that's resilient, founded on good governance, and also create jobs for the Nepali people.
So I have a follow-up question that what are the requirements Nepal should fulfill before the final review?
Yes, so thank you for that question. As you had said before, we're at the tail end. So there were 7 reviews for this under this program. Nepal has successfully completed 6. We have 1 more review. Under this review, there's very important structural benchmarks. In fact, there's 4. One is on the amendment of the Nepal Rashtra Bank Act. On the financial sector, we want to ensure that the financial sector is very strong and resilient. And for that, Nepal has to complete the loan portfolio review. We would also like to take a look at how Nepal does the asset classification regulations, which I think would also help to have a more holistic picture of the health of the banking system. And we haven't forgotten about the fiscal sector as well. Revenue generation is an important component, and so we'd have one on the customs strategy.
Dr. Srinivasan, youth-driven movements have brought corruption, transparency, and inclusive development to the forefront. So, how is the IMF supporting Nepal in building a accountable governance framework that fosters broad-based economic participation for all?
Oh, that's a very good question. So if you look at what's the performance been under the program, the key objective of macro financial stability has been achieved. The question, of course, is has there been sufficient inclusive growth? Growth has been pretty good, but when you look at youth unemployment and so on, it's pretty high, not just in Nepal but in the region. So the question is, how do we go from there? And I think that's where the point I made about making sure that private investment picks up in strong terms is important. And that is linked to issues like governance, transparency, the rule of law, security. Now, in our program, even though we focus a lot on macro and financial stability, the pillar of governance and corruption, anti-corruption is very strong. To give a few examples, Sarwat mentioned some. For example, in terms of the central bank, making sure that the central bank has autonomy in terms of institutional autonomy, financial autonomy, personal autonomy. That's been important. That's important for governance. It's important. Same thing on revenue mobilization, as Sarwat mentioned. Fiscal transparency has been a key pillar. Into also going back to the central bank, now the financial statements of the central bank are being audited by internationally recognized auditors. So these are elements of the program, of the fund program, which talk to the issue of governance and anti-corruption. Now, clearly, there are people who feel disenfranchised and they feel that their voice needs to be heard more. And that's where the emphasis has to be much more on governance reform, anti-corruption, and those are things which we will take up. And the bottom line is we talk about growth, but growth has to be both strong and inclusive. And that's where we need to do more work. The people of the policymakers have to take that as a challenge to see how can you generate the kind of jobs which are needed, which are meaningful, right? You see a lot of exodus of Nepali citizens going abroad.
Exactly.
I mean, that's reflected on the remittances.
Exactly.
But the question is, should they be going out? How can you create jobs within the country? And that's where I keep emphasizing the fact that private investment is quite weak in Nepal. That needs to pick up. And for that, you have to create the environment which will make that happen. And once that happens, you will see more gainful employment opportunities for the people, for the students, for the youth. And that should make them a lot more reassured that growth is not just strong, but also is inclusive.
Exactly. Dr. Sarwat, finally talk a bit about the recent Gen Z uprising and political uncertainty in Nepal. Following the Gen Z uprising on September 8 and 9, 2025, Nepal has seen a major political shift, including the new government and announced election. How does the IMF assess the impact of these recent political changes on Nepal's short and medium-term economic outlook?
Great. Thank you for the question. First, on behalf of the IMF team that works on Nepal, let me express our sympathies for the loss of lives, injuries, and damages that happened during the social unrest. We were deeply saddened by the events, but at the same time, we were heartened by the resiliency of the Nepali people who are striving for a better future.
Exactly.
In the near term, we had discussed a bit about the growth earlier, and we expect this growth to continue in this fiscal year. So in the near term, we expect economic recovery, although it could be at a more moderate pace. But still, we believe that the correct policies will be in place. So as we had discussed before, stronger investment, especially in strategic capital projects, macroeconomic policies would be supportive, and there would be fundamental changes in structural reforms. Over the medium term, we think that Nepal's outlook is broadly favorable, and that's because Nepal has a lot of potential. For example, greater investment in hydropower projects would be a big source of growth, as we also think that the IT sector could help develop as well. You had talked a little bit about, what are the major pillars, and Krishna had mentioned this also. The interim government made a pledge to address corruption, improve governance, and to create jobs. And we think this is the fundamental issue that has to take place in Nepal for, to reach its potential. And of course, the IMF is a steadfast partner for Nepal to achieve this goal.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, with the election scheduled for March 2026, what are the fund's expectations regarding the new government's commitment to ongoing reforms?
So we don't comment on politics and elections and so on. We stay out of that.
Sure.
But our hope is that the youth have expressed their feelings towards various aspects, notably on governance and corruption. One would hope that whichever government comes to power in March takes this more seriously and works on improving the climate for investment, improves governance and anti-corruption measures, and that would go a long way towards addressing some of the key concerns of the youth, which is important. I think at the end of the day, what you need to do is to create meaningful jobs for the youth. You have to make sure that people feel a part of the development process, which we what we mean by inclusive growth. And there are issues of governance which clearly came to the fore. Those have to be addressed through meaningful reforms, and that's very important. And the IMF has been a partner so far to every government. We will remain a steadfast partner to the government, and we'll help provide not just in terms of policy advice. We also have providing capacity development support, technical assistance. We'll continue to do all that for whichever government comes to power. We'll work with them to make sure that the hopes and aspirations of the youth are well addressed.
And if I may add, Krishna had started with the outlook of the global economy, including with the Asia-Pacific region. Asia's story in 2025 is a story of resilience.
Yes.
But I'd like to remind everyone, so too is Nepal. We had talked about growth, macroeconomic stability, but I'd like to emphasize that Nepal now has to take a step further. So the hard-won macroeconomic stability now must be accompanied towards growth. And the growth must not only be strong, it has to be sustained, durable, and it must create jobs and equal opportunities for all. And as Krishna had mentioned, we look forward to continued engagement with Nepal on these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna. Thank you, Dr. Sarwat. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and thank you for sharing your invaluable thoughts. Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dhanyabad.